Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Hunting for Silver Linings. Today is Wednesday, January 20, and I'm here in the Great Lakes region of the U.S., Michigan, Grand Rapids. I'm the chapter director for Startup Grind Grand Rapids. George, where in the planet are you right now? Because you've been mobile.
Well, still in the US, believe it or not, I'm respecting international communications, physical communications, that is. Still in Florida, but very close to Jacksonville.
Okay, cool. Yeah, when I spoke to you yesterday, you were making me jealous with pictures of the coast when you were in Naples. Um, Anyway, so Hunting for Silver Linings, we are excited to be bopping around the planet. Already this week, we are in Zurich, and we were speaking with Professor Westra just the other day at Calvin University here in Grand Rapids, and now we're excited to be introducing everyone to Professor Markman, who is at University of Texas at Austin. He's a professor of psychology and marketing, and also the director of the IC2 Institute. It's a think and do tank founded in 1977. I found Professor Markman through his writing at Fast Company, and then also have recently discovered that he's a prolific author of many books. His latest being Bring Your Brain to Work, and I wish more would wish it was easier said than done, right? So with that, Professor, really great to have you with us.
Oh, it's great to be here, Corey, and you know, I don't know if everybody knows this. You and I and George, we had a chance to talk last week a little bit and get acquainted, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, so like Startup Grind, as I explained to you last week, we're a community of ecosystem builders, and we operate across the planet in not just the exciting big ecosystems like a San Francisco or what is now in Austin, right? But also in real tiny little towns and markets. So with your work with the IC2 Institute on that, we're really thrilled to have this conversation and introduce you to the global community. So maybe you could give us a few minute background on you personally, your interests, what brought you to the intersection of marketing and psychology, and how you found your way into the IC2 Institute.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a cognitive psychologist, actually a cognitive scientist by training. Cognitive science being that mix of psychology and artificial intelligence and linguistics and philosophy and all this whole interdisciplinary group that really tries to understand how minds work. And I just fell in love with that work actually in college and went to graduate school in psychology because in the late 80s when I applied to graduate programs, computers were slow and stupid. And so I didn't feel like they would be up to the task of doing real artificial intelligence. And I'd make more progress as a psychologist than as somebody in computer science. Might make a different choice if I were doing it all over again today, but things have worked out okay, so I'm not going to complain. Spent a lot of the early part of my career doing research on reasoning and decision-making, motivation, categorization, writing a lot of papers that get read by 30 of my closest colleagues in the field, and doing work like that. And starting about 15 years ago, really also began to think about the implications of that kind of work for everyday people who might not be in the research community, but might benefit from knowing the research, and started doing a little bit more outward facing work, blogging for Psychology Today, Fast Company, had a piece in Harvard Business Review that came out today. I ended up with a radio show and podcast called Two Guys on Your Head that's produced by our local NPR affiliate KUT. And that led to doing some corporate consulting work. Did a lot of work for Procter & Gamble over the years as part of their initiative to bring cognitive science into their organization. That led to all sorts of other things, like some of the books that I wrote were actually based on initially on some courses that I developed at their request, and also led me to be asked by the university to create a liberal arts-based program that would help people in business and government and nonprofits in the military to understand people. And that's a program called the Human Dimensions of Organizations. That's an executive master's program, has some non-credit courses, and is actually now an undergraduate major at UT with about 500 liberal arts majors in it. And And that, of course, that engagement at the intersection between psychology and really the human-centered approach to thinking about what goes on in businesses also led me to interact more and more over the years with the folks at the IC2 Institute. So IC2, as you pointed out, Corey, was formed in 1977 by George Kosmetsky. He was dean of the business school, also founder of Teledyne, so an independently wealthy guy who gave a significant gift after stepping down as dean to create the IC2 Institute in order to promote what at the time he called wealth creation, which in 1977 really meant how do you get communities to work together to lift everyone up economically, as opposed to these days, sometimes when we talk about wealth creation, we're talking about that much more in concentrating wealth in the hands of fewer people. So it really was that kind of broad-based approach, and it was very much an ecosystem approach. So the Austin model of ecosystem, startup ecosystems that involved what Kosmetsky actually called the technopolis, which was this complex interaction between business and government and universities, was I think foundational in helping Austin to go from being a sleepy college town in the late 70s to being the Austin, Texas that graces the pages of Inc. and Forbes and things like that now. But when I was asked to take over as executive director a couple of years ago, the question was, where is this focus on development of ecosystems most needed now? And it isn't in the Austin, Texases of the world. And many communities are never going to become Austin, partly because Austin becoming Austin involved a lot of dumb luck. Some lucky breaks, but also just, having a guy who wanted to build computers and quitting school and forming a small computer company, that became Dell. Not every town gets that, that doesn't always just happen. So we began to look at what happens outside of those urban centers. So when you get to smaller communities, not necessarily small rural communities, but smaller communities, it might be a town of 30 or 50,000, even an isolated city of 100,000 or 150,000 has a very different environment than a community that's part of an urban core. And so we really wanted to focus on what happens in those communities. How can you create an ecosystem there that is congenial to building business, and one that really does lift up the whole community and create that overall wealth that has escaped so many smaller towns.
Thank you. That's I've just been taking a bunch of notes. I wish we had 4 hours for this conversation.
Well, we can always pick it up later, right?
I appreciate that. Now, I read your director's message for the IC2 Institute that was posted on the 11th, and that was just about a week after some dramatic events here in the U.S. I've had maybe 8 conversations with other ecosystem builders around the globe, and clearly what happens in the US is on everyone's minds.
Yeah.
Something that you wrote in that address says that you look for opportunities beyond the clouds, and our program's like we're staring at the clouds looking for that silver lining, and you're looking beyond the clouds. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about what you're excited about upcoming beyond these clouds?
Yeah, I mean, I think that any time that things get thrown into chaos, that creates both difficulty and opportunity. And it's funny, when we shifted the mission of the IC2 Institute towards looking at smaller communities, there were some of my more cynical colleagues who said, well, short of destroying the economy and then trying to rebuild it, what makes you think you could have an impact on small communities? And I said, well, we're going to learn as much as we can and see what we can do. And in the meantime, the world did its best to try to at least shake up the economy, if not destroy it, in ways that I think actually create a lot of opportunities for smaller towns. there is, I think that if you look at trends over the last 30 years, one of the things we've gotten very good at is supply chain optimization. We've really done a lot of just-in-time manufacturing. I mean, frankly, Dell Computer and its success was really based on a recognition of inefficiencies in supply chains in the computer market that allowed them to have a competitive advantage on price on a product that at the time was expensive. The reason Dell has struggled over the last 5 to 10 years is that computers went from being something that was very expensive, where a 5% reduction in cost based on supply chain optimization was a huge competitive advantage, to one where computers are largely commodities, where it's hard to compete on price. And that's forced them to really rethink their business model. I think one of the reasons that they had to go private. So, from our standpoint, for many years when we were optimizing the supply chain like that, well, it was very hard for American communities to compete in that environment, because there wasn't really much of an appetite for redundancy. There wasn't much of an appetite for things being produced domestically when you could save a little bit on the labor costs if you ship things overseas. And I think what we've seen over the last year is the absurd but logical conclusion of that, which is that, I did an op-ed a while back where I said, look, it's sort of like driving a race car at 200 miles an hour around a race course. As long as the conditions are perfect, you can do it. But as soon as the conditions are less than perfect, you run the risk of spinning out and hitting the wall. And I think the well-worn example now of the toilet paper shortage, which initially everyone wanted to blame on people's tendency to want to hoard, but really ultimately became recognized as a failure of one of the two major supply chains associated with toilet paper, which is there's a kind of home use and commercial use toilet paper, which is why the stuff you have at the office is never as good as the stuff you have at home. And when suddenly everybody was working from home, there was a run on the stuff you use in the house, while there were warehouses full of toilet paper that you would put in offices, and so we because we had very little resilience in that supply chain, we had problems. Well, now I think there's a lot more appetite for saying, maybe a little more resilience at the cost of some some efficiency might actually be a good idea, to be a little bit more resilient to these kinds of shocks. That is absolutely something that smaller communities can participate in. And so it creates a tremendous opportunity. So who knows, right? I mean, I think we have a lot of new opportunities. I also think the work from home change has mattered a lot. It's, if I don't have to be 15 minutes from my office, then maybe living in a larger house with a little bit more yard, a little bit further away from people, if I've got at least reasonable broadband access in my community, is not a bad way to live. So that opens up a lot of opportunities as well for smaller communities. So I think this is actually a great time for people who may have felt a little bit left out from the last economic recovery to really dive in and have a great decade.
Yeah, the last economic recovery globally kind of just didn't even pay attention to a wide swath of the population. It's as if we weren't even there.
And which, by the way, is not unrelated to some of the political unrest.
Right. And we see those movements coming out of that throughout history, right?
Yeah.
Before I move on, George, do you have a related question?
Yes, I was actually wondering, given this wonderful introduction, Professor, do you think it would be possible to give us a couple of examples of how you started and what did you do? What was your intervention, so to speak, in medical terms, in psychological terms, and how did you come out? What was at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah. So, we've played with this in several different places. And so I'll give you stories at a few different levels of maturity, I guess. One of the oldest collaborations that relates to smaller communities actually comes from something that predates my directorship at IC2, but certainly not I've been engaged with the Institute for about a dozen years, which is actually several communities up in northern Sweden that we've worked with. And worked with to try to create some startup ecosystems. And one of the things that they do particularly well there is regional collaboration. So, you know, one of the difficulties that smaller towns have relative to larger communities is that they don't always have all of the resources that they need inside of the borders of that community to be able to sustain a new business or attract a new business. And whereas, you know, you look at a place like Austin where Tesla, you know, is coming to the Austin area, you know, we've got a lot of folks here. I mean, some people will probably move here as a result of that, but we have an awful lot going on already. So we didn't need to add a lot in order to be attractive. But you know, smaller towns, if they want to attract you know, a big partner, they don't necessarily have everything they need in their borders. And in northern Sweden, one of the fascinating things that they did was to actually, so one of the things that they were able to do was to use some of their natural resources to attract companies. So for example, there's a lot of server farms up there because it turns out the average temperature for the year is generally around freezing, which is, you know, bad for many people, but really good if you're a server farm where a lot of the cost comes in trying to cool the place down. And so they've done a good job of making use of their natural resources, but they've also made good use of their collaboration. So they are now home of Northvolt battery. And Northvolt wanted to locate its factory in one of the communities there. And that community said, you know what, you're actually better off putting the factory at our neighboring community down the road and allowing us to do some housing and to house some support companies that will pop up in, you know, after the factory is built, because the landscape here is better for some of those smaller firms, and the landscape in this other neighboring community is actually better for building the larger factory you want to build. Now, it's rare that you get a small community saying, oh, no, please don't locate here. Please go up the road because we'll actually all benefit from that. But because of this focus that we've talked about for a long time, you know, at IC Squared about really collaborating, about thinking regionally, you get a very different approach. And I think had any one of those communities thought that they were in competition with each other, as opposed to in competition with some other country or some other region of the country, then they might not have been successful in getting the factory at all. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times when you look at economic development people who work in communities in the United States, they tend to think, well, if it doesn't happen inside the borders of my community, then it's not happening. And I'm in competition with everybody around me. As opposed to, for example, in Texas, having a series of communities in Texas thinking, well, we're just trying to make sure that we get development here rather than, I don't know, Montana, right? You know, that it's not local competition. It's more of what has sometimes been called co-opetition in the literature. So that's one kind of example, which is a much more mature example because Northvolt's actually already done the move and already gotten off the ground. To go to the other,
Professor, just a quick question on this
Sure.
example that you mentioned. What role did the company itself play? In other words, was it who were the stakeholders that pushed for this kind of innovative thinking?
So the folks who really, I think, pushed the regional collaboration were some of the city government leaders in one of the communities who really sort of galvanized everyone in the region to think regionally, which then enabled them, when an opportunity arose, you know, as happens when you get wind of a company that's looking to locate something, you get into the running for it. But part of what they were able to do is actually by virtue of having some government leaders, as well as some folks within one of within Luleå Technical University who were some of the folks that we had initially started working with. But that government university collaboration, I think, really promoted the regional approach rather than the specific kind of single town approach.
And in this particular project, did you approach the university or did they come to you and say, Professor Markman, help?
Yeah, so that was a that actually came out of we were IC Squared was doing projects where we were trying to engage communities in Europe to teach them some of the ecosystem methodologies we had, and so we were reaching out to a number of universities at the time, and that was one of the groups. So Luleå Technical University was one of the groups that came and interacted with us as part of that outreach process. And you know, we've tried different kinds of outreach processes over the years. This was one that was focused on trying to help universities to become hubs that might then help companies around them. And that's always been one approach that we've taken, is that, you know, universities can play, I think, a very central role as part of any startup ecosystem. Partly because we sometimes have expertise in ecosystems that we can share, partly because we're also a source of students. Students are great cheap labor when you have startups around, but also people who remain cheap labor after they leave universities. And of course, a lot of universities also are the source of really cool ideas that could be spun out into companies and products. And that's also been, you know, a great reason why universities play a role in that. And so to the extent that we were able to share some of our experience with other universities so that they could play that same hub role elsewhere, that's certainly been one approach that we've taken over the years at the Institute. More recently, we've actually tried to engage directly with community leaders. And that's you know, so over the last year, one of the things that we did was to create what we called our Rural Economic Recovery Initiative. So this was really a matter of last March, we sat around thinking, wow, you know, things are really, it's going to be a mess. The university had just shut down for the semester. You know, we canceled all of our we brought all of our classes online. All of us were suddenly working from home. So we were sitting in a Zoom meeting that looked much like this. And we were really thinking, well, what could we do? You know, this pandemic is going to be devastating, but it's not going to last forever. And so the time to be thinking about how to emerge from the pandemic is actually now, and not, you know, at the time we were wishful in thinking, well, not 6 months from now when it's over. And who knew that 6 months was going to be 18 months. But still, the time to really be trying to figure out how to grow the economy post-pandemic is immediately, not after it's over. And so we began to think, what could we do to help that? And so the first thing we did was we found a generous donor who didn't actually care a lot about economic development, but did care about students in need, who said, well, this sounds like you'd be able to provide a bunch of students with jobs helping with your research. So we'll give you some money to fund those students, and then you do with them what you think is needed. And so we hired about 70 undergraduates over the summer to study communities around Texas and Louisiana to understand the threats that they were facing and the opportunities that they thought they might have available to them. And we did that through interviews that were done, you know, using tools like Zoom, as well as a survey instrument where we had people do things like allocate points to various kinds of projects and to in order to tell us what they thought that their potential needs were. And so this was an initial analysis of threats and opportunities. That process fed into a program that we called Regional Accelerate, XLR8, that you know, because after all, it's the 21st century. You know, and Regional Accelerate was a program where we tried to teach regional collaboration and regional strategic planning. And so we got 150 community leaders from 58 communities around the state and Louisiana. And we brought them together on Tuesday nights. They had to do a little bit of homework before and after each session. And we got them together to really go through an exercise of identifying something that they thought was a target of opportunity given the state of the pandemic, and then to work regionally to try to bring that to fruition. And so these communities developed ideas, and then for those problems that they came up with where they thought the solution was going to be hard to develop, we then had a third leg to the Regional Economic Recovery Initiative stool, which was the second George Kosmetsky's Student Challenge, which allowed students to create teams and study the community and develop solutions to those problems, which they then pitched in front of a panel of judges, and we actually gave away some prizes to the students. So we engaged with communities in that way, and there are a few outcomes from that I think are quite important. One of which is, people who work in municipal government in smaller towns are often not government professionals. So in a town like Austin, you have a sort of pretty professional political class, and you have a fairly extensive bureaucracy in order to run a city of this size. But what we find in a lot of small towns is the person who's mayor is, the person whose turn it is to be mayor. And he's not so happy that it was his turn now that COVID hit. And he's not prepared for it. And so just getting people together and forcing them to talk with other community members about challenges and opportunities with a framework for developing a plan is a much more structured approach to thinking about economic development than many of them would have engaged in otherwise. It brings them
essentially, you depoliticized the process. You took politics straight out and you said, let's find solutions.
It's exactly right. Exactly right. And we encouraged people to reach broadly through their community. Who's not at the table and how can you get at them? Because everybody's got to participate. And so, we're 12 weeks past the first run of Regional Accelerate. So I can't say we've revitalized the economy of any particular town. But what I can say is that many of these communities feel like this is the first time that they've gotten groups of people like this together in years to really think comprehensively about how to change the nature of the economy. And, one of the fascinating things is that because of things like the CARES Act and because of other expenditures, there is money floating around for infrastructure projects and stimulus that communities can begin to take advantage of. For example, Austin, Texas just voted for a rail bond that's going to spend about $7 billion over the next several years on a light rail system that's desperately needed, as well as a commuter rail system that's going to create a lot of opportunities in the region for communities to get involved as I've been saying to people, if you got somebody who makes cement in your town, now would be an awfully good time to start making cement rail ties.
Professor, just to interject for a moment, making an observation here. Not only did you depoliticize the process by seeking solutions and by bringing together a motley group of business leaders, in a sense, agnostic of where they come from, but you also essentially watered down or completely eliminated the stigma that is associated sometimes with, oh, we have a problem and we're a small community, so therefore people will look down upon us because it's our fault. It's we are responsible for our actions, etc., etc., etc. So I think that from the behavioral perspective, I think you have really hit the nail on the head, if you may allow me to say so. But I think by bringing together the expertise of hands-on approach of previous cases, you have now created a kind of pathway where you actually act as a benevolent moderator, and through specific questions, I assume, case studies and all that, you direct them to specific outcomes.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that's most important is really to help the communities to understand themselves and to understand the pathways that exist for success, right? So having them think through and engage with various modes of financing, for example. that they may or may not have considered before. I think one of the dangers that universities have always had in getting involved in these kinds of projects, particularly in smaller communities, is for them to come in as if they know the answer already for a small community. And not only is that bad optics, it's actually bad practice because there is a lot of expertise in smaller communities, but that expertise revolves around what, the history of that community, how it got to where it is right now. And history is a blessing and a curse, right? That history is valuable to understand because nothing can happen if you don't respect and understand that history. But you also then have to help people to use that history as a jumping off point rather than as an anchor. And I think, part of what happens in a lot of these small communities is that they develop a very fixed mindset that says, well, this is who we are, as opposed to this is who we were. This got us to where we are, but we've always been dynamic. If you put a large enough lens or a long enough lens on the history of any community, you realize that it grew and developed over some period of time, even though many of those communities now have stagnated a bit and are seeing some of their younger folks leave the community. So what we have to do is to reinstate that sense of dynamism, that sense of growth, and that sense that things can move forward, and that if the community is different in subtle ways 5 years from now than it is now, that's actually a success. I think there, in many small towns, you find people who are afraid of change.
It is interesting that you are talking about history. You very much remind me of Jared Diamond, and essentially the fact that the elites have to make decisions. And at the same time, I see that you're decomposing Michael Porter's sustainable competitive advantage, which is wonderful. It is brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, George. No, I appreciate that. So it's been an exciting time. It really has. I think I'll tell you one other thing that we're trying to do. I mentioned this when we had our conversation before, but we're also trying to encourage our students to think about moving to smaller communities or returning home to small communities. So as a large public university and as the flagship campus of the University of Texas system, there are kids who grow up being dressed in burnt orange from birth, right? No matter where they live in the state, the goal is for them to someday get into UT and be a Longhorn. And when that happens to students who come from West Texas, from small towns there, or in the Panhandle, or in East Texas, some of those students, they come to Austin, and that's it. That's their jumping off point. And now they return home for holidays, but they don't really come home to roost again. And I look, returning home is never right for everyone. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and now I live in Austin, Texas, right? So certainly plenty of people move on from where they started. But I think that many of our undergraduates at Texas don't appreciate some of what their hometowns have to offer. So they never even consider moving back. So one of the programs that we started a couple of years ago that I really love is something we call Home to Texas, where we send our students home for the summer with a paid internship. So we do some fundraising. We actually pay the students $5,000 for an 8-week internship. And it's important to us that we pay them a good wage, because many of the students who come from these smaller communities need to make that money in order to be able to come back to school in the fall. And so it's important to us that we're not making this accessible only to the most elite, that this is actually available to all students. Now they go home, they do that internship. While they're home for the summer, they actually study their community. They interview business leaders and government leaders and civic leaders and faith leaders, and they get to know what's going on in town. And what's really amazing about that program is by the end of the summer, the students have discovered that their hometown is actually kind of a cool place, that there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there. And the other thing that's fascinating that happens is that the people who are involved in the internship on the other side, the employers, discover that college students are actually pretty cool. You know, there's a, I mean, there's a persistent narrative that kids these days are lazy, you know, and I don't know, maybe it's just that UT is special, but our undergraduates are just amazing kids. They're amazing human beings. They're very creative and hardworking and dedicated. And by the end of the summer, our internship supervisors can't stop raving about the students that they had. And it, you know, I think that by developing programs like this that give students an opportunity to see what life in these smaller communities is like, it opens up a possibility for enhancing the workforce in some of these communities that that really was not something that people were considering before. And we're hoping to expand the program over the next few years so that we're not just sending some of our students home for the summer, but also giving students who might want to consider what it's like to live in a smaller town to try it out. That's just a little bit more expensive because we got to provide housing for them.
Yeah, I'm happy that you ended up that we ended up here. One thing that I read while learning about the Home to Texas is when it's written, changing the world starts at home.
Yeah.
And what we see in our conversations and what I hear from the fellow ecosystem like nerds around the planet is that entrepreneurs are getting more and more excited, especially mid-pandemic, for staying home.
Yeah.
The lure of the great city is not so alluring anymore. Even in the suburbs of Chicago, people are like, I can't wait for my 15-minute city or my 5-minute city to arrive, right?
Yeah.
And we're already in some communities seeing like the now new restaurants are coming in on the street and they're taking advantage of lower rents. And
Yeah.
it's still very early for all that. But of course, globally, we have these ecosystem nerds. We're all entrepreneurs in the community. We have about 3.5 million of us in Startup Grind. However, we're not afraid of changing the world. Like that's like we have that mindset, right? We're like, let's do it, let's go.
Yeah.
But we're definitely siloed in our focus.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you would be able to give some recommendations or methods that our ecosystem builders, or maybe some warnings or tips when we look around ourselves, we look out the door, out the window, look right, look left, and when it's time to engage outside of our silo to really benefit our ecosystem, what are some tips for discovery? And what are the right questions to be asking? And maybe I don't want to have you give too much away for free because
No, it's all right. There's more where this came from, right? You know, it's the model. First one's free, boys. But no, it's fascinating. So we've done some studies. One of the ecosystem models that we've developed, people like to use different metaphors, and one of the metaphors that we like a lot is the metaphor of the coral reef. So a lot of the central, when you look at a lot of startup ecosystems in particular, a lot of the successful ones have some sort of entity that plays the role of a reef. It's a little bit protective for some of the smaller entities, but it creates, it's interesting enough that lots of fish swim around it. And when they swim around it, they engage in these haphazard interactions that bring people together to engage with each other. So the thing about a startup ecosystem is you can't know in advance which conversation, which collaboration is going to be the one that creates the spark that leads to the company that really succeeds. So what you're really trying to do is to create enough of those interesting conversations that involve business talent and tech expertise and finance expertise and just people who are brimming with ideas, those folks I call the expert generalists who just know a lot about a lot. You get enough interactions among those people, and that's what creates the connections where suddenly a great company spins out of that, or a company that was struggling turns the corner and finds its pathway to profitability. The thing about the reef is you can't get people to show up to it unless it's consistently interesting. And so one of the things that's important is there needs to be a commonality in the desired business model. So for example, there's a lot of startup incubators in places like Austin that are incubating companies that are going after what I affectionately refer to as the big score model of entrepreneurship, where the desired exit is either an IPO or a big sale. Now, Austin can support enough companies like that because it's large, and because it's got enough. It's got enough of a cool factor that if you were to sell a company and make a mint, you'd probably still stay here. As opposed to a lot of smaller towns where if somebody makes millions in a sale, they might or might not want to stay home after that. They might want to move somewhere else. So that big score model doesn't always work in other communities. But if what you have is a mix where you have some companies that want the big scores, some that want to be more of a bootstrap, some that, if you have different models of that, it's very hard to create interactions among people that are consistently interesting, because you show up to a company and you discover that they want to be a $10 billion company, and that's not what your expertise is. And so like a third to a half the interactions you go to, there's nothing there for you at all. And what you need is a higher hit rate than that, because think about it, we're all busy. So, you show up to something, think about the podcasts you listen to or the radio shows or other things. Which ones do you listen to? The ones where at least 4 out of 5 times it's good. Otherwise you give up, you move on to something else. So there needs to be an agreement within the community. This is really what we're going to go for. We're going to be a bootstrap community. We're going to be a group that really wants to create companies that that are what I think of as affectionately, not pejoratively, called lifestyle companies. I want to run this company for the next 15 years, but I want it to be successful and I want it to grow and I want it to be a pillar of the community. If enough different people agree that that's the mode that you're in, then what you do is to create interactions for the rest of the fish in that reef that are consistently interesting, because the people with the financing have a sense of what they might be able to provide to each of the groups that they're seeing. The business talent knows what kind of organization they're dealing with and whether that's in their wheelhouse. So there's enough consistency that people feel like they can actually contribute, as opposed to having so much heterogeneity that you show up to something and you realize in the first 5 minutes, I got nothing to offer you, but you're stuck in the meeting for the next hour. At that point, you're like, I just can't take this. So creating things that are consistently interesting for the people who are there is important. Another thing about smaller communities that's incredibly important is the willingness to put aside just what you want. So the thing about being in the big city, and the line I've been using on this, is that in the big city, all you need is the coalition of the willing. If I show up and I try to convince somebody to engage with me and they don't, I'll find somebody else. But if I'm living in a town of 22,000 people, if I go in and have a meeting with you and you don't want to engage with me, I'm sort of stuck, because there aren't going to be that many other people that are going to be close enough in their interests. So what I need to do then is listen a little bit more and be willing to adapt the way that I'm approaching thinking about business to be a way that's a little bit more compatible with what's going on with the people around me. I mean, that's where that human element comes in. I have to have a little bit more humility, that I can't just bend the world purely to the way I think it ought to be. Now, that doesn't mean I have to give in. It doesn't mean that I don't have something important to contribute, but it means I have to make that contribution in the context of all the people who are there already. And we've been in a lot of communities that are not succeeding because what they have is a very strong-willed, strong-minded person who's just trying to make things happen their way. And in the process, they turn a lot of other people off. And so what you find is a fractured community. There's a group of acolytes who believe in the Savior. And then there's a whole bunch of people who say, oh, you talk to one of them. And And you know, if you're a small town, you just can't afford those kinds of factions. People have got to work together. And so you have to be willing to park that ego at the door and get down and get to work with the people around you and have your influence from within rather than just trying to pull people to the way you want to do it. If that's the way you want to act, which, you know, I get it. There's some people who just can't be the team player. Then maybe you want to go to the big city and see who you can attract there because there's only room for one Reef in a small town.
It's too bad the small town can't gently nudge that individual to the big city. You know,
Yeah,
be a little more. There's a great place we found you over here. You would love
it's called New York.
um, so yeah, we in West Michigan we have an interesting example where we had a royal family say, "This is what I want for the community. I'm going to invest all this cash, and we're just going to be birthing unicorns left and right." But what's become really successful is the fact when they did put forth that came around to being humble and said, you know what, actually, we just need to be like birthing a ton of lifestyle businesses.
Yeah.
And so we have this, they have a van that drives around into every community across all wards, you know, across all like demographics and social, whatever. And they do like 1 minute pitches.
Yeah.
And it's like 100 ideas type thing. And then they have this big demo day and it's 100 lifestyle businesses. There's not a single unicorn in there,
Yeah.
but that's what has been revitalizing our community.
That's terrific. You know, and I think one of the other things is not just, you know, I think initially you get a lot of people who are sole practitioners who just have an idea for this thing they want to do, and that's a great start. The next thing though that we find is really valuable is helping those people who've got 3 to 5 employees but could be bigger to expand to have 30, because there is a qualitative difference between having 5 people and having 30 in the way that your business runs. When you have 5 people, everybody is chief cook and bottle washer, right? I mean, you got to do whatever's required at any moment in order to get stuff done because there just isn't anyone else to do it. By the time you have 30 people, you got to have an HR department, or at least like an HR person, right? You have to have some defined roles. And that is a hard chasm to breach because it requires putting some systems in place. And not everybody has the expertise to be able to do that. And I think that you know, but those 30-person firms are a little bit more resistant to economic shock.
Mm-hmm.
They create a little bit more wealth in the community, which creates those people who can populate the big civic organizations, who can sponsor the you know, the local theater and things like that. I mean, you need a certain number of those very successful entrepreneurs, where a successful entrepreneur is, you know, I started a company that employs 35 people, right? And you know, really focusing not just on how can I get you to take your you know, very cool idea and turn it into a small lifestyle company, but how can I take your small lifestyle company and turn it into a medium-sized lifestyle company? Not doesn't have to be huge. We're not necessarily saying you got to be a global conglomerate, but you know, if you can take your idea and be the regional supplier for this, you know, then you've actually built a tremendous amount of wealth inside that community.
For our community, I'm really excited the fact that we've gotten past the difficult task of convincing people that it's even acceptable to try something new.
Yeah.
In the first place.
Yeah,
You know?
true that. Yeah.
This, like for some of our entrepreneurs, they don't even know they're called entrepreneurs. You know, it's like,
Right.
And when they come into some of our programs, and some of them which I mentor through, the first call is they're just so apologetic that they're not a bigger company. And I said, no, you are doing the best. Congratulations.
Yeah.
On starting something too, and even showing up at this call. Like, this is amazing. Like,
yeah, no, it's great. You know, I'll say one other thing that's really important, which is a lot of times the first idea somebody comes with is one that doesn't necessarily bring enough money in from the outside. So the survival of small communities ultimately relies on a certain amount of money coming into that community from elsewhere. You know, one way to say this is you can't survive as a small town if all you try to do is to buy and sell stuff from each other. You know, at some point there have to be people from outside who are sending you money, particularly because no matter where you are, there's going to be some number of big companies from outside, retailers, chain restaurants, things like that, that are sucking a certain number of dollars out of the community. Not to mention that the government takes its share through taxes. So you've got to replenish all that with extra. And so, you know, the other role that I think the startup ecosystem plays is in getting people to take that initial idea and think a little bit about how it can bring in money from the outside, you know, through the way that it sells, through its market, but also to do it in a way that is compatible with, but not always identical to, the audiences that other businesses in town are catering to. So, for example, in Texas, we have a lot of communities that have bought into into tourism as their source of money, right? So we have communities in the hill country of Texas, west of Austin, where there's now suddenly, you know, when I moved here in 1998, you could drive in that area and, you know, there'd be the occasional storefront. Now there's wineries and breweries and, you know, and distilleries and all sorts of places like this that you could go visit. They're pretty, but they, you know, it's tourist dollars that are propping that up, which when there's a lot of disposable income around is great. When the economy is not so great, and when it turns out if you get closer than 6 feet to people, you die, then that's a less attractive proposition. And if the entire economy of the region is built on attracting that money, then you're very low on resilience.
Well, there needs to be some diversity, right?
That's right. And so, you know, promoting that diversity and you know, and really saying, well, that's a great idea, you know, but how can we tweak that a little bit to think about other audiences that idea might reach, so that the community as a whole thrives throughout the business cycle.
Yeah.
Professor, may I ask a couple of questions related to resilience, but also to succession?
Sure.
First on resilience, what do the results of your interventions show? For how long does this jolt, this rejuvenation last?
Well, you know, I think that you have to create an ecosystem that actually is willing to continue talking, and you know, how long that lasts depends a little bit on, frankly, on the model that you choose. So the more that you rely on this big score model, the harder it is to be a small town, because really everybody who strikes it rich in a small town suddenly decides that Austin is actually kind of a cool place to live after all. Because you know, and I think that it's rare to get somebody who really strikes gold in you know, in that game and then says, yeah, but I'm going to stay in my small town. It happens, but it's not the norm. So, you know, when you get a community of successful business people who support each other, that's when you create, I think, a community that can last longer, right? So it's a matter of really trying to instill that like-minded mindset that says we can actually grow together, and we have to set our expectations, right? None of us are going to have, you know, bank accounts with 7 or 8 zeros, you know, on the trailing edge there. But we all might do really well and live comfortably and feel good about the impact that we've had on our community. So I think it can be resilient, but only if you create a spirit of community out of it, rather than I think that one of the reasons that people often look to Silicon Valley and to places like Austin is because there are people in those communities who haven't just succeeded, they've gotten absurdly rich. And hey, if that's your goal, I mean, who am I to tell you that that's the wrong goal? But it's going to be a very hard goal to pursue sustainably in a small community.
Your analysis brings the second question to the fore, namely intergenerational wealth transfer.
Yeah.
Will the children of these entrepreneurs who got together on a Saturday afternoon and they said, we're all friends, we realized that it's better to be a small participant in a big pie than to be a big frog in a small lake.
Yeah.
You had a commitment of minds, you had a confluence of forces and ideas. Is this transferable from one generation to the next?
Well, I mean, this is a problem that we have in the United States in general. I think mobility has actually created low levels of transfer. There are many fewer long-term family businesses. There are many fewer children who are staying in the same town that their parents grew up in part because, at least for the last 25 or 30 years, maybe longer actually, maybe 40 or 50, we haven't really made it a priority for that. I think there are ways of creating that as a priority. So, because we as a society tend to promote find your passion, find your bliss, you as an individual have to figure out what you want to do. We forget the degree to which experiences that we engage in also shape who we are. And I think that an alternative is to have parents, if they're involved in successful entrepreneurial ventures, to engage their kids early. Bring your kid to work. Come to some of these civic meetings, and sit around with us and see the way that things are planned. Learn how the sausage is made from early on. In many ways, our Home to Texas students, they go home and that's when they discover how cool their hometown was. Well, some of them could have learned that lesson earlier, only nobody really felt like they needed to teach it. And I think, we can't necessarily rely on the school system to do it. We have to reach out, whether it's to our own kids or just to kids in general, reaching out to the high school, the middle school, getting kids involved and saying, hey, here's actually some neat stuff that's happening in town. Get involved, come on, hang out. And I think when you do that, you create a certain amount of excitement because you allow people in a rising generation to envision themselves as part of that community. And when you think about how it is that college students make decisions about careers, they make those decisions in very arbitrary ways. It's an offhand conversation they had with somebody, or by luck, a particular interview that they had that sets them on a path that ultimately leads them to, years later, where they end up living. Well, the alternative is plant that seed early, that your hometown is actually a place that you could settle and be successful, and have that be part of one of the forces that shapes how those people make decisions as they go through college and pursue whatever education they pursue, thinking all the while, yeah, I could go back and be a part of that and be a part of that community and work side by side with some of these people that I grew up with, that I respect. So you can do that. We just tend not to.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. You're highlighting the importance of aligning vision, mission, values. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're at the end of our hour together. Just really want to thank you again for the generosity of your time. And we ask every guest the same last question, and that is, what can the global network of entrepreneurs, innovators, ecosystem builders of Startup Grind do for Professor Art Markman and IC2, or
Yeah, well, I would encourage people, check us out, IC2, IC squared, ic2.utexas.edu. Check out what we're doing. If you find it interesting, reach out. The more the merrier. We love to engage with people. The programs that we do are largely run. We work all over the place, but a lot of our impact ends up being closer to home because that's where it's easiest to make connections. But we're happy to work with people in other places. And if you've got a local school where local college or university where a program like Home to Texas would make sense, hey, we'd be happy to help them get that off the ground. We don't want to, when we thought of that idea, we immediately went online and thought, well, somebody else must be doing this, and we couldn't find anyone doing it. We'd love for there to be 50 places doing it. It's not about, it's not about being unique here. It's about if it's an idea that's working, so help us make connections. That's more than anything else. That's really what we want.
Great. I can think of a few ecosystems that are looking for some folks, some help.
Right.
And they might know that they need their reef to be interesting, but they're just like, how do we get there? Right?
Yeah.
They might understand that, yeah, we want to make sure that everyone is congenial towards business, but it's one thing to say it. It's another thing to bring the people together. So
Absolutely.
any last parting thoughts, George? Or
Well, I simply want to thank the professor. And one of the parting thoughts that I had is, if you have time, why don't you try to create with the students a startup grind community, or some kind of a podcasting where you summarize your weekly or your monthly, so to speak, developments. That would be a wonderful idea.
Yeah. Well, we're definitely looking for some ways to continue getting the word out about what we've been working on. We do have a regular blog up on our website. We do have some videos that we're putting together that we're going to start to show some of the things that we're doing. We're going to have some panel discussions over the next several months that we're going to be posting on our website and the YouTube channel as well. So yeah, we definitely want to do that, and we're open to all kinds of things. Really, I think the joy of being at a university is, for us, if people find the things that we're doing useful and they use them to make their lives better, that's a win for us. We don't have to be a unicorn. We're already
Well, as
longhorns.
we're getting ready to end this conversation, I just have one perhaps thought that crossed my mind. Next time, we would like to interview you with either or of two addenda. One is your most successful community, someone from a local community who would like to speak about what they did with you.
Sure.
And the second is an entrepreneur from a community that you worked and you saw the project from within.
Yeah.
I think that would be wonderful in its own right.
Yeah, that'd be great fun. Absolutely.
Thank you, Professor. Have a very good
Terrific.
afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks so much.